Hello, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Freeze.
And Mrs. Freeze back again with another lesson from our progressive unit. Today we're going to look at some of the progressives, the people, the reformers, people who wanted to make positive change to fix the problems that we were experiencing, problems from industrialization. So problems in the factories and problems in the cities from the growing city population that we had.
So, if you look back at this term, the progressives, you can actually see what they did. You can see even in the word that they are going to be reformers because they are going to make progress. They believed that changes needed to be made, and they believed that changes needed to be made at the local and government and federal government level.
You also, just to point out, you might hear this word progressive thrown around on the news at times. There are still politicians today that are considered progressive politicians that want to make changes for the better. So if you look at what we have going on here, it tells you the US government had a very laissez-faire approach toward business and the economy. Mr. Freeze is sitting here with his hands up off the desk because he still wants you guys to do that.
Hopefully you are too. Laissez-faire means hands
and
off.
I'm just making fun of him, but That's okay. But if you remember what we said up until this point in history, the government really just didn't do much of anything, especially with regards to business. And they weren't making tons of laws for business owners to follow. They wanted to let business prosper and profit. And businesses love this. But there comes to be a time where people start to say, maybe we need some rules and regulations. Maybe we want safer working environments and safer products. So you see this thing spring up, the progressive movement. It mentions here it starts as a grassroots movement, meaning it's organization at the local level where people start to want certain things. Like these kids, they want to go to school. You might be thinking, ugh, blah, school. But let me tell you, if the alternative was you working 12 to 14 hours a day in a dangerous, horrible factory, you might want to go to school and get educated so you could have a better life.
Okay. Then this movement became much more than just a grassroots local movement. It spread to local government, state government, and eventually the federal, which means the national level of government. For example, school, as we mentioned before, started off in the early 1900s. You can see in the picture on the left a local Philadelphia protest in 1904. So in 1904, kids are like, hey, we want school. By the time you get to 1917, Mississippi, every state had required children to go to school except for Mississippi. And believe it or not, Mississippi is the last state to require that children attend school by 1917. And finally, only in 1938, with the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, which said children pretty much have to go to school and you can't have children working in factories instead of going to school during that time. So you see it moving from a local to a state to a federal level.
Now, if you look, the big thing you have to understand about progressives, and you will definitely be asked something like this on a quiz or a test at some point, what did progressives want? They wanted the government to be a part of problem solving. They said there are some problems that are so big that they cannot just be solved by local charities or just people by themselves. The government has to step in. And in particular, they said government really has to step in to help the most vulnerable people in society, the poor. And so that is what progressives wanted, was the government to play a more active role. So what are some of these problems that we're talking about that progressives wanted to fix? So if you remember, our country has just gone through a major revolution. We've become an industrial nation, and now all of a sudden people are working in factories, our cities are growing and booming, and so there are all sorts of social issues, which is what we're going to look at today. Now, problem one, okay, and we're going to go through a few problems here. You have all these people new to cities, some people who have just moved off farms, some immigrants from whether it be that old wave or also more so the new wave. They come to these cities and they need to go to work every day, but they find they have a problem. Parents need to go to work. They can't afford daycare. They don't know what to do with their kids.
By the way, do you see the connection today too to this? Many people right now are screaming. I just read a petition this morning. Many people are screaming for governments to help take care of some of these issues because right now
Schools are closed.
Schools are closed, and so there's no one to take care of children. And people are saying, look, the government needs to step in and help people get back to work. So this was much worse back then, though, because not only was there no daycare, people were also illiterate, had very little skills, and so Jane Addams is going to step in.
So Jane Addams is this pretty impressive woman. We are actually going to talk about a lot of impressive women in history who sometimes get overlooked in textbooks. But Jane Addams, she is briefly mentioned in your book. She was kind of this upper class woman in Chicago, and she sees that in these poor neighborhoods in Chicago, there's families that they don't know what to do with their kids when they go to work, so they leave them at home by themselves, sometimes tied to a table so they can't leave the house. And it's not what these parents want to do. They have no options. They don't have resources. They can't read and write. They have no money. So she says, she talks to some other upper class women and she says, let's establish what today we would kind of call a community center. And she gets this house that's called Hull House. Now, what Hull House was, back then we would have called it a settlement house. And these houses started to spring up throughout our nation. And the purpose of a settlement house, and Hull House specifically was Jane Addams' settlement house in Chicago, it was a place that was open to help the community. So Jane Addams and these other women would run a daycare center out of there and watch these children so their parents could go to work. They would run English classes. So if you were new to the country and you wanted to learn to speak English, you could. They would help people learn to read and write. They would also just allow for opportunities of social interaction. And so they did great things for the communities in these areas.
So just to recap, you have a social problem of no daycare. That's a social issue. And these progressives are coming up with solutions. She didn't need a federal law to do this. She just stepped in. However, laws will be passed requiring public education for all children. And as a result, believe it or not, illiteracy rates drastically declined. Now, if you don't know what literacy is the ability to read and write. And if you look at the chart down here, the number of people in the United States who are illiterate, vastly, almost everybody in the United States at this point in time, by the time you get to 1979, can read and write effectively.
So if you look at that, in 1870, 20% of our population,
it's one out of every 5 people,
read and write. And that's not good. There's very little you can do if you can't read or write. But as the years go on, as school becomes more common for everybody, that goes down. All right, now problem 2. Again, another social problem, poverty. So just people not having enough money, and things like prostitution, people having sex for money, if you don't know what that is. But here's the thing. No one, Mr. Freeze is chuckling over here at me. Well, you know what? If we were in class, some 9th grader would purposely raise their hand, can you explain what that is?
That's true.
So anyway, the thing is, no one, as they're growing up as a little girl or boy, is I want to be a prostitute one day. It just does not happen. Why people do that is because they feel they have no other options in life. And so there was this guy, here he is, his name was Walter Rauschenbusch, and no, you're not going to have to probably spell his name ever. He started this thing called the social gospel movement. So he was basically a pastor at a church in a really tough neighborhood of New York called Hell's Kitchen. Just the name of that neighborhood should tell you what it was like to live there. And he was a pastor at this church, and he looked around and he said, you know what? The church has to do more than just tell people to pray and, this and that. So the church should play an active role in helping people in the community. So if you're a church in a poor neighborhood, help the people in your neighborhood find a job, teach them how to read or write, help them get connected to a place where they have daycare for their kids, help people in their actual lives, don't just talk to them about, praying and heaven, actually help them. And so he also was part of this social purity movement about he wants to try to end prostitution, have people take a different path. He wants to, just as a side note, venereal disease will start to decrease as we see less prostitution and just better behavior.
Okay, problem number 3, and I think you guys will enjoy this little story here.
Another strong woman here, ladies.
Yeah, well, strong or crazy, that's for a debate there. But alcohol was blamed for everything from prostitution, wife and child abuse, unemployment, and industrial accidents. And we will learn in our 1920s unit all about the differences between alcohol. The alcohol that Americans were drinking at this point was much different than the alcohol that people had drank in Europe. The alcohol content in American alcohol was incredibly high, and it led to things like people not showing up for work, people coming home and being so drunk that they beat their wives and children. And there was a group of people known as the temperance movement who will advocate or support a ban on liquor or alcohol.
Now, if you look at this picture up here, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, you notice a lot of women. Women were a big part of the temperance movement because a lot of women saw firsthand, unfortunately, how alcohol could sometimes turn their nice, lovable husband into someone less lovable. And so they thought that society as a whole would just be improved if alcohol was not such a prominent influence.
And this group is going to be a pretty effective group. In fact, at one point in our history, alcohol will become illegal to distribute and produce in the United States. So the temperance movement and these women will be very effective with creating laws that will ban alcohol. And it's known as the temperance movement. A nativism or dislike of foreigners also helped to fuel the temperance movement. And because you're not here, we'll help you out with this. But there were a lot of immigrant groups that were stigmatized for drinking. In fact, the Irish were often portrayed as being alcoholics. The Germans were portrayed as being alcoholic,
big beer drinkers.
The Russians were portrayed as vodka drinking individuals as well. And
so just real quick, this term nativism, we'll actually come back to it in a later unit, but there are points in our history where we see this, where we see Americans having a strong dislike of foreigners. And so, all right, there's people that want to ban alcohol for reasons like, abuse and stuff like that. But then there's other people that are really just trying to take away something from foreigners that they think foreigners so need, whether it's the Germans and their beer. But anyway, let's talk about this woman, Carrie Nation. So I don't know if you can tell just from this picture of either of these. This is a cartoon. This is actually her. She was a rather large, imposing woman. She was over 6 feet tall. So you guys are not in school, so you don't realize how tall Mr. Freeze is, but he's like 6'4", 6'5". So she's getting up there in height. And Carrie Nation suffered through a bad marriage with an alcoholic, and it left a bad taste in her mouth for alcohol. And so she basically was a large part of this temperance movement. Now, she was one of its more radical members, and you'll see with what she does, what I mean by that. She would actually go into what we would call a saloon at the time, which was basically a bar, and she would go behind the counter and smash up with a little hatchet all the bottles of alcohol. And was this legal? No, but she believed in this that strongly. And so again, she was a more radical member of the group. Most members of the temperance movement sought other ways to, they would petition our government and stuff like that and say, let's get rid of alcohol. She really took her hatchet and just went to town, as you can see here. So another problem. Okay, problem number 4. Horrible working conditions, long hours, and low pay for workers. So again, these people some of them have left farms, some of them have come from other countries. And they're living in cities. They're working at these horrible jobs that none of you would ever survive a day in.
And some of them didn't survive back then. In fact, you guys read about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, or you saw a video about it. Workers got pretty sick and tired of these horrible long working hours and low pay, and they started organizing. And when you organize your workers, you form what's called a union. And those unions, UNI, that prefix means one. A union is a group of workers who organize as one for the purpose of gaining better wages, hours, and other benefits.
We'll talk about unions kind of throughout the year, but they are a really essential thing for workers. If you work at a job where you are part of a union, you have a much better chance of getting good wages, good health care, good working conditions, because you have bargaining power with your boss, because you have strength in a union. And we will come back to that at later points this year. If you're wondering how do unions achieve their goals, they sit down, like the leader of the union sits down and negotiates with the boss. And again, they have more power because it's not just one person, they're speaking for the union. So if you're an employer and you don't want all your workers walking off the job, you really want to sit down and try to negotiate. Sometimes if negotiation doesn't work and workers really feel like they are being treated poorly, they may go on strike and refuse to work until the situation is corrected.
And New York City school teachers just did that. That's why they're starting school today, because they said, look, we don't have enough protections against the coronavirus. We want protections put in place and rules put in place until we return back to work. So some realized that strikes weren't enough to protect workers, though, that a strike was only a temporary thing, and that legislation or laws, as you see that word down there, that's going to be a big term with this lesson. Laws are going to be needed to protect against things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. In fact, what you are looking at here with this picture with these women had just been striking weeks earlier before the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and weeks later, they, because of the working conditions in that factory, were forced to jump to their desks to avoid being burned to death. So they realized, look, more permanent laws need to be put in place because strikes are only temporarily effective.
All right, now problem number 5, and this was really a big problem in the day, unplanned pregnancies. So women at the time, especially if you're living in these cities, you're married, and women would just find that they were in this never-ending cycle of just constantly being pregnant. They'd have one baby, then they'd have another baby, and some women got very upset by this, and they're like, I'm married, I am going to have sex with my husband, but I sometimes want to not wind up with a baby. So they think, well, what can be done about this? And you might be sitting there thinking, oh, there's tons of things you can do. There's protection, there's birth control. But here's the thing. At the time, most states had laws that birth control was illegal. You couldn't, not only was birth control illegal, you couldn't even talk to people about it. You couldn't pass out a pamphlet.
So obviously
birth
abortion
control
was illegal too.
Right, in a lot of places. And so here you have this woman come along, Margaret Sanger, and she leads this thing called the birth control movement. So Margaret Sanger was a nurse in New York City, and she would see all the time the horrors of what these women would go through. Women would come to her and be like, I'm pregnant. It's my 6th kid. I cannot have any more kids. We have no money. This is a huge strain. And she leads the birth control movement. And she had also witnessed what had happened to her mother. So growing up, her mother went through an ungodly number of pregnancies. She had miscarriages. And over the span of 22 years, 18 pregnancies, that takes a toll on your physical health. Pregnancy is not easy. And her mother dies relatively young, 49. And Margaret always thought that why her mother died so young was because of the turmoil that her body went through. And so she starts the birth control movement. And the thing was, she's going to go around and try to speak to women and give them information about different methods of birth control. And you'll see here in this picture, she's going to be arrested, okay, many times. But she's like, I don't care. I'm going to keep doing this because this is what is right. And women cannot have a healthy or satisfying life if they cannot control their bodies.
Now, looking to today, Margaret Sanger is actually one of the founding members of Planned Pregnancy or Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood.
A clinic that provides health services for women if you cannot afford to go elsewhere. Sometimes you'll hear stuff in the news about them, about abortions and stuff like that. Most of their centers, I don't even think perform abortions.
No, but they do give advice, just like Margaret Sanger did, and that led to her arrest. However, she also, and her name has actually been taken off of the Planned Parenthood website and building. And the reason why is because she was also a big fan of eugenics and selective breeding in
I was
order
just
to
talking
improve,
about that today with my period
Yeah.
2W class.
in order to improve the human race. So although she's viewed as a progressive in some ways, some of her ideas are not very progressive at all.
Right, like
And
sterilizing people.
So
they
you
can't
need to
have
realize
kids.
in history, there are complicated
Characters.
Yeah, there are complicated characters that, there's no clear, this is a good guy, this is a bad guy, or in this case, woman. They were people of their time who had their prejudices and their problems as well. So some of these progressives, we're going to lead into a new section. We're called muckrakers. Now, muckrakers is actually a job. I had a friend who was actually one of the groomsmen at our wedding who was actually working as a muckraker at the time. He worked at a horse farm. And in fact, we have a friend. We've actually been to a dairy farm where those cows and those horses, they will
All they do is poop.
All they do is poop. And
all they do.
An actual muckraker is someone who takes this long, long rake and will take the hay and the muck and the urine and they will rake it and clean it up. And then it will reveal what's underneath.
All right. But in our terms, okay, when we're talking about muckrakers of the progressive era, and if you're in my cultural history class, we were just talking about this the other day, they were investigative writers. They were journalists who would research endlessly about things, and they would write articles and books that would expose the problems in society. So some muckrakers might be writing about the problem of child labor. Others would write about corruption in government. Others would write about John Rockefeller and how he monopolized the oil industry. So every muckraker had their particular cause, and they figured if we write about these things and make it public knowledge, the public will do something to put an end to these problems. Now, one that we're going to come back to at a later point was a photographer. So you didn't just have to write, you could actually be a photographer and expose problems that way. Louis Hine went across the country documenting in his photographs pictures of little kids working in unsafe factories. And he figured if I can show enough of these horrible pictures, Americans will not stand for it. They will put pressure on the government to pass laws to end this horrible practice. Now, another problem, so again, we're still looking at social problems here, were the way African Americans were treated. We've a long history of problems with this in our country, but the particular problem we're looking at here is in the South. It was dangerous to be Black. African American men were frequently lynched. If you don't know what it means to be lynched, it's murder by a mob, where they would murder you for some time, for all the time, pretty much no reason at all, and then they would hang you. And if you look at the numbers here, it's rather startling. And so in the South, who could African Americans turn to for protection? Not really anyone. Sometimes the white police were involved in these lynchings. So there's a woman, Ida B. Wells, who is also another impressive woman. Her parents die young. She takes care of her siblings at a very young age. She lies about her age so she can become a teacher and make money and take care of her family. But 3 of her very good friends get lynched in the South. They open up a grocery store, these 3 Black men, and the white grocery store doesn't like the competition. So they end up killing the competition. And she says, this is not okay. This whole thing is just not okay. So she starts to write about it to expose this problem so that hopefully it can be corrected. At a certain point, she actually advocates for African Americans to move up north because she just thinks that the South at this particular time is not safe.
Yeah, she was even like the Rosa Parks of the 1800s. Like she got on a train and refused to get up for a white man, got arrested for that.
She really was. She was Rosa Parks before there was a Rosa Parks. And if you're looking at this picture and thinking, what a disgust. So here is a man hanging from a tree, and what a disgusting picture this is. And if you notice, like these people standing around, there's little kids here. And if you look, these white people standing here, they're not like hiding their faces or running away for fear of the police coming and arresting them. Pictures like this were taken all the time because they knew there would be no justice, and they knew that the cops would not do anything.
Not a lot of shock on their faces.
Yeah.
The other problem, and we've mentioned a lot of this in this unit, is that big business practices were leading to unfair competition. We talked about John D. Rockefeller buying up other oil companies, and you've looked at some political cartoons showing very similar things of companies buying up other smaller companies. We've even talked about modern day monopolies as well. So this is still an issue today. So Ida Tarbell wrote about the unfair business practices of John D. Rockefeller, and she was really inspired by her father, who had an oil company and was driven out of business by John D. Rockefeller.
A lot of Pennsylvania, like small oil producers, were put out of business by him.
In fact, she wrote in this magazine called McClure's Magazine all about the unfair business practices and how ruthless John D. Rockefeller was. And there's actually like an urban legend rumor type thing that John D. Rockefeller actually lost all his hair because the stress that this woman's writing put on him. There's even a rumor that he slept with a revolver underneath his pillow because he felt that so many people hated him that someone would come into his home in the middle of the night and shoot him. So this woman was pretty angry about her father being put out of business and got her revenge through McClure's Magazine.
Right,
she was a muckraker.
It was a 19-part series, and what people loved about her writing was that she could take even complicated things like how the oil industry works, and she could write it in such a way that it was simplified so any person really could understand it. And right, so she wrote endlessly to expose him and his business practices. Now, another muckraker, Upton Sinclair. So this guy actually had one intention behind his book, but then it kind of went another way. He wrote a book called The Jungle. And what he did was he wanted to expose the horrible working conditions that working class people had to endure. So what he did was he went and actually lived and went to work with this Lithuanian immigrant because he wanted to detail this guy's life and how difficult it was. It just so happened the guy worked in a Chicago meatpacking plant. So Upton Sinclair would go to work, write down all this stuff, and then when he publishes the book and people read it, they are so caught up in the disgusting nature of these meatpacking factories that they really lose sight of what his actual intention was about exposing the working conditions for these poor people. So his quote, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So people got really caught up in things like how there were rats running everywhere in the factory, how there was rat poop everywhere, and how they would put down rat poison to kill the rats. And all this was going into your meat. And, a worker would lose a finger in a machine and that would go into your meat. And so people were so alarmed by this. And they put a ton of, after this book came out, Congress and President Theodore Roosevelt actually passed a law that basically said that our food and our medicines that we take have to be safe and sanitary.
And we still have this today. The Food and Drug Act, at that point, it was all due to the meat scandal. So as a result of progressives, you need to realize the reason we learn about these people is because they actually made changes. They made progress. Laws were passed limiting the workday. Laws were passed banning child labor. In fact, many of you still have to follow these laws today. If you're thinking of getting a job, working papers are part of that. Laws were passed requiring the safety of workers and food. We still have these rules around today with the Food and Drug Act. Laws were passed requiring children to go to school. We still have this today. That's why you need to go to school. Laws were passed restricting or forbidding prostitution. We still have those laws today, unless you're in Nevada. Laws were also passed banning the sale of alcohol. So pretty much the effect that this progressive era has, except for the last one, banning the sale of alcohol, still are with us today. These progressives changed the United States and made laws that many people see are changes that have benefited the vast majority of people in the United States, especially, as we mentioned in the beginning, the most vulnerable people, the poor,
women,
children. And so that's our lesson for today. We have an activity for you guys to complete along with this lesson. If you waited until afterwards, you can obviously complete it afterwards as well. Have a great one, and we will see you guys later.